All right, we are taking a break from our usually scheduled programming to discuss lawsuits and why everyone hates my profession. Now, that's not true. It's not everyone, it's just most people. Okay, maybe not even most people, and maybe hate is too strong a word, but the reality is trustworthiness among real estate agents, at least in the public's perception, ranks down there with used car salesmen and attorneys, and nobody likes those guys. There are a number of reasons for this, some of them earned, some of them not. And both of those categories coalesced into this massive real estate lawsuit you may have heard about that really did change the way we do things in the real estate industry this year. So I thought it'd be a good idea to sit down and talk about this and bring you up to speed on this lawsuit, what it was, what the reason for it was, and what the subsequent changes have been, and how the industry is reacting to those changes, and really what it means for you if you're going to go to buy or sell a house. How is it going to be different now than it was a year ago, 5 years ago, etc. And as you probably know by now, I am a real estate agent. Please don't hold that against me. But I could see how it might seem like a realtor talking about a lawsuit that targeted realtors and that realtors lost, maybe some sort of conflict of interest. Sure, maybe it is. Honestly, I don't know. But what you also probably know if you've watched this channel before is I just do my best to give it to you straight, good, bad, or indifferent. I am interested in giving you the truth. Whether you choose to work with me or you choose to work with a real estate professional at all, because by the way, you don't have to, and you never did. My goal is to be the most valuable channel for this sort of information in this market. And I've built this whole thing on that idea, so here we are. So let's get into it. As you probably know, if you watch the news at all, last few years, there was an ongoing lawsuit, a massive lawsuit, dare I say, that targeted the National Association of Realtors and most of the biggest real estate brokerages in America. And the basis of the allegation was that the defendants, the National Association of Realtors and all these real estate brokerages, conspired to inflate real estate fees by enforcing this cooperative compensation rule. And we'll come back to this cooperative compensation thing because this is really the crux of the whole issue. But basically, cooperative compensation means that typically sellers are paying the real estate agents for both the buy side and the sell side. So if you go to sell your home, typically you'd be paying the commission for both agents in the transaction. The lawsuit claimed that this cooperative compensation practice prohibited sellers from being able to negotiate the amount that they would offer to the buyer's agent. Pause right there for a quick reality check. That is not true. If you follow this story at all, you may have heard somebody say at some point, real estate commissions are and have always been negotiable. It's this little bumper sticker we're saying now. It's like the new date the rate, marry the house. It's annoying once you've heard it so many times, but it is true. This cooperative compensation model, the most common model by far in 95 or maybe even 99% of transactions I've worked in my career as a real estate agent, yes, the seller is paying both the buyer's agent and the listing agent. But they were always able to negotiate it, what they paid the listing agent and what they paid the buyer's agent. I have never walked into a listing appointment and had the seller go, cool, so it's 6% total. We give half to the buyer's agent and half to the listing agent. Where do I sign? In my experience, the consumer knows that these fees are negotiable, but also it's incumbent upon the professional to be clear about that. The fact that, oh, you were paying the buyer's agent and the listing agent, and also those fees are negotiable. And because they're negotiable, it's incumbent upon you, the agent, as well, to make sure that you're providing enough value and explaining the value of the buyer's agent in the transaction to account for these fees. Of course, that's how things should go. And in reality, things don't always play out the way they should. So I think there are two little wrinkles here that cause this lawsuit to come to fruition in the first place. Number one, there are shady agents out there. Remember that thing before about how most people don't trust us, or at least they trust us just as much as a used car salesman? Yeah, this is the reason. The reality is it's not that hard to get your real estate license, and it's a low barrier of entry, so a lot of people can. And the industry for a long, long time has not done a good job maintaining a standard of professionalism across the board. There are a whole bunch of good, even great real estate agents out there. There are also a whole lot of bad ones, and I've worked with plenty of agents on both sides of the fence. So yeah, from where I'm sitting, real estate agents largely are at fault for the fact that this was even introduced, because too often they were not transparent about the fees that the seller is paying, what those fees are, why they're paying them, and who they're paying them to. On the flip side, it was always in writing in a contract that the seller signed. Always, always. It's not enforceable if it's not in writing. And so at least the way we do our contracts here, it's spelled out clearly. Now, again, we're moving from idealistic into realistic. Does everybody read everything they're signing all the time, especially when there's a whole bunch of documents and disclosures and you're just trying to sell your house and there's probably been a significant life event that's causing you to do that? I have never read an end user license agreement in my life, and I have signed off on hundreds of them. This is different than that because the stakes are much higher, but you get my point. Nonetheless, a jury found the defendants guilty. They basically said, plaintiffs, what you're alleging is true. And they issued $1.7 billion in damages to the plaintiffs. Huge, huge number. And one of the reasons this case has made so many headlines. About half that money is going to end up going to the attorneys, but I digress. So the fallout of such a huge judgment, number one, there's a lot of money changing hands, a lot of penalties being paid by real estate franchises and by the National Association of Realtors. And number two, the industry is going to have to change the way it does a few things. So the National Association of Realtors got together with the Department of Justice and basically said, okay, here's how we're going to change things going forward to atone for this judgment, to atone for the fact that a jury found that there were shady practices going on in the real estate world. How are we going to change things so that this doesn't happen again? This is where we get to the most important part of this video because there's a whole lot of information online. There's a whole lot of headlines that were made about this case. Some of them true, some of them misleading or blatantly false. My favorite being this CNN article that says the 6% commission on buying or selling a home is gone after Realtors Association agrees to seismic settlement. That is not really true and is sort of missing the point and is confusing and misleading. And fun fact, the original version of this headline when this story dropped last spring was even better. It was the end of the mandatory 6% commission. Mandatory being a hilarious and wildly incorrect word to use there by an alleged news outlet, so they toned it down to something less incendiary, but also at least partially still untrue. So first of all, while we're getting to what's happening, here's what's not happening. And part of the reason I'm making this video at this point here in September is because these changes went into effect nationally and locally here in the Denver metro in August 17th. And so we're about a month in for when these changes happened. A lot of the commentary I've seen around this was leading up to when these changes were launched, leading up to that August 17th deadline. Here's how things we think are gonna go. Well, I wanted to get into this and talk about how things are actually going now that the changes are instituted and we're off and running in this big new world. So when people talk about 6%, number one, that's split between the listing agent and buyer's agent. And that's never been mandatory or never been the only thing someone could pay, obviously. What I've seen most often in the Denver metro, because these fees are negotiable, is somewhere between 5 and 6% total between buyer's agent and listing agent. If it's at 6%, typically that's 3.2 to the listing agent, 2.8 to the buyer's agent. Again, I say typically because it can be all over the place, but that's a good range. 2.5 to 3% is what you see most often, not always. And in the last few weeks to a month, that remains the case. I've not seen a significant change in the amounts that are being paid out at all. But the big change is how these commissions are being offered to the buyer's agent. So in the past, there was a field in the MLS, the multiple listing service, the service that we all use as real estate agents to input properties and search for properties, kind of where all the data is held. Well, there was a field in there for the seller to say the amount of compensation they are offering to a buyer's agent. So 2.5, 2.8%, they put it in this field. The buyer's agent knows what this seller is offering, and that's what they get paid. Now, this is the big change. That field has gone away. In terms of functional changes from this lawsuit, this is the major one. It's actually pretty minor, right? It's just the field going away in the MLS. But the big change is now as a buyer's agent, rather than just being offered compensation, you have to negotiate it on your behalf. So one of the biggest conversations around this lawsuit has been, oh, are buyers now going to have to pay their buyer's agent rather than the buyer's agent being paid by the seller? And the answer to that is maybe, and I'll get to that in a second, but most often no. At least in terms of the way things have gone here in the Denver metro, what I've seen, and this is no surprise in the last 4 weeks, is sellers by and large are still offering compensation to buyer's agents. Now, there can be situations in which a seller's not offering compensation to the buyer's agent. Now, and in the past, I've run into this a number of times in my career where if it's a for sale by owner, for example, or if it's just an off-market property that a buyer found and we want to offer on, well, there isn't a listing in the MLS, so we wouldn't have been able to utilize that MLS compensation field to begin with, back when that was a thing. So in those situations when I'm working with buyers, I did then just what every agent is now having to do. I negotiated my buyer's agent compensation from that seller. Say, basically, here's our offer, here's how I get paid, here's how much I get paid. That becomes now part of the offer, just as it has been in these special circumstances in the past. So now, rather than just saying, oh, I'm a buyer's agent, here's what I get paid from this seller if we're going to offer on this home and close on this home. Now it's incumbent upon the buyer's agent to say, this is how much I am requesting to be paid as part of this offer. Could there still be situations in which a seller, even after that request, says, no, I don't want to pay a buyer's agent at all? Yes, that's a possibility. And in that case, depending on how your buyer's agency agreement is written, the buyer could and would be on the hook for that commission. So what I'm telling people when I work with them as a buyer's agent is 99% of the time, the seller is going to offer some compensation if I ask for it. At least that's been my experience. There could be, and I'm sure will be, select instances in which the seller says, no, I'm not offering anything. Then buyer and buyer's agent will have to have a conversation. Okay, buyer, do you still want to offer on this house and know that you will be responsible for paying the buyer's agent compensation? Or do you want to look for something else where the seller is offering something, so then you're not on the hook for it as the buyer? And you're seeing why most sellers have in the past and now are still offering buyer's agent compensation, because in terms of selling your home and getting the best price for your home, it's not a great idea to not pay your buyer's agent, because then buyers, instead of being on the hook for that money themselves, are going to go and look for something where they are offering compensation. But here's the deal. As the seller, that is your right. That is your choice. That's a decision you're making in this negotiation, whether or not you want to pay a buyer's agent, whether or not you want to pay a listing agent. You don't have to pay real estate agents at all now. And guess what? You never did. You, of course, know that if you're watching this video because you've seen something called the for sale by owner. This has been a practice that's gone on for decades, maybe even longer. I don't know. Some people choose to not work with real estate agents at all. They want to do it on their own. That's the great part about this. You have choices as the consumer. We could talk about the pluses and minuses of that. Obviously, I have thoughts on it, but that's a different video. So that's the biggest change out of all this. Now sellers cannot offer compensation to a buyer's agent through the MLS. The buyer's agent has to negotiate it on their behalf and also has to have that conversation with their buyer, explaining basically what I just did. Hey, I'm going to do my best to negotiate this from the seller, and there's a good chance I'll be able to do that. But if it's not the case and you still want this house, well then unfortunately you're going to be on the hook for this compensation. The good thing about this, I think, is it's going to make buyer's agents have to be a lot better at understanding, articulating, and actually just providing their value to their client, because this client is going to understand that there could be situations in which I will have to pay this fee. Again, and I hate to keep harking on this, but there was always that possibility in the past. It's just more readily apparent now. The other practical change to all this nationally is that now buyer's agents will be required to have a signed buyer's agency agreement with their buyer, explaining what duties the buyer's agent is handling and what they get paid and how they get paid. So this is all in writing. In Colorado, we've already had this requirement for a buyer's agency agreement. So this is nothing new here. Real estate varies quite a bit state by state. So some states haven't had this as a requirement. Now every state will. We've been doing this a long time, so this particular change doesn't pertain to us so much. The actual agreement has changed a little bit to make it clearer about who's paying me as the agent and how much they're paying. But this is a conversation I have with the buyer as we go through this agreement and as we start working together. Basically exactly what I'm telling you now. So on the idea of value, I want to talk about that real quick. So as a seller, why you would want to offer compensation to a buyer's agent. I think we covered that. It's going to be much easier, much faster to sell your home to work with a buyer's agent to do that. They're going to bring in more buyers, and they serve a really important role on the buy side of the transaction, ensuring that this gets done, their client is represented, and you're getting to closing. But for a buyer, because it's up to you whether you want to work with an agent, and if so, which agent you work with. So what's the value for working with a buyer's agent as a buyer? Well, number one, the first thing I look at is it's the biggest financial transaction of most people's lives. Not everybody, but buying a house is a really, really big deal. And working with a professional, as long as they're good, is going to be the best way to safeguard your financial interests in that transaction. It's a whole big process. And for someone who hasn't bought a house before, or even for somebody who has, you're probably not brushed up on exactly how the process works, like somebody who does it for a living day in and day out. And that really spans the entire process, from scheduling showings to making offers to how much should we offer and what should the process be like, to getting your offer accepted, to figuring out what a home is actually worth, and then going from contract to closing, inspection, navigating appraisals, all that other stuff. Typically, when people choose to work with a buyer's agent, those are the reasons they do that. They don't want to take on a new part-time job to figure out how to do this themselves. Same reason someone hires a mechanic or a plumber. But then there's the question of which buyer's agent you work with. So, okay, Sam, well, why should we choose you? Every agent's going to have their own answer to this, but I typically look to a few things. Number one, my unique value in a transaction, beyond the stuff we already talked about, right? Beyond protecting your earnest money and making sure you're making a good, sound investment. People who work with me typically want someone who's an expert in Denver neighborhoods specifically, especially people who are moving here from out of town, who are going to say, hey, all right, I know I want to move to the Denver area, but where do I want to live? If you found this channel, you've probably seen some of my neighborhood tours and stuff like that. I really do relish the opportunity to be that local expert and get you in the right place. Number two, communication. I put a lot of emphasis on being excellent communicator throughout the process, both with the client, with the buyer, and with the other agent on the other end of the transaction, because communication can be the difference in getting to closing or not. So your agent being an excellent communicator, number one, is going to make you the most comfortable because you're not being surprised by things. And number two, give you the best chance to win. I get you the house you want for the best deal. And then lastly, negotiation. I put a lot of time and energy into being an excellent negotiator, making sure my clients win by understanding the state of the market and understanding what we have to do in a particular situation, and then getting that just through the negotiation process. And my view on negotiation is not what a lot of people think it is. I think the most effective form of negotiation is not pounding the table and, demanding this and my client and really being that douchey agent that everybody hates. I do it through empathy and through relationships and through making you as our partner in the transaction understand our point of view, and then making you aware that we understand where you're coming from too. I think just listening and being empathetic to the other side is going to open up a lot of doors and make people want to work with you in ways that demanding things does not. We always come from a position of strength, and there are a number of different ways to do that, and making it a positive experience for whoever is on the other end, that can be the difference between getting what you want or not. I don't know. I hope this was helpful. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I'll be back with a neighborhood tour or restaurant lists or something else next week. But if you made it this far, you're the best. Talk soon.